So in the Jewish worldview of Jesus' time, the Holy Land was the center of the world, and Jerusalem was the center, the city at the center of the Holy Lands. And at the center of Jerusalem stood the temple, and at the center of the temple was the Holy of Holies, an empty, silent space where it was said the finger of God touched the wild, chaotic world and held it still. In all the busyness of the temple, the Holy of Holies, in all the busyness of Jerusalem, the Holy of Holies remained silent and empty for most of the year until once a year on Yom Kippur, a priest would enter the holy space, offer sacrifices on behalf of the people, and it was believed in that way bring the world back into balance. It was a stark contrast between the stillness of that holy center and the busy, chaotic, political nature of the rest of the city. Jesus knew that's where his path would eventually lead him, where the seats of religious power and political power converged. The ancient texts had been clear that the coming Messiah, the one to save Israel and set things to right once and for all, would come to Jerusalem the Messiah would come to Jerusalem for as remarkable as it was and as beautiful and vital an earthly city that it was to become was still more remarkable, the city of heaven where God would dwell with God's people, where there would be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things will have passed away and a new order established. It's poignant to hear Jerusalem referred to in that way in this day and age, where there would be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order had passed away, and we know the old order has not passed away. Jerusalem had been awaiting the Messiah, and by the time of the passage we have this morning that Matt just read in the story as told by Luke, Jesus had a sense that the one who is to come, that he was that one. Pretty clear that all the expectations surrounding his coming would be spoiled by how he was actually going to come, not involving chariots and armies and battles, but hearts and souls. It wasn't what he himself would have necessarily chosen for himself, but he had resisted the temptations in the wilderness to choose a path more to his liking or to his comfort, and he had given himself over to God and the invisible creative stillness at the center of all the chaotic world. So Herod, who was ruling Israel at the time, had his reclamation project going on of Jerusalem, and he was responsible for the stunning reconstruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which had largely been destroyed centuries before, but rather than being an expression of devotion to God, Jerusalem restored and the temple restored was reflecting the greatness of Herod's own power and his own legacy, or so he thought. There was no relinquishing of his ego for the sake of God. In fact, all of this talk of a coming king, coming of a different order, was going to need to be snuffed out, which is why he sought to kill Jesus. And that's what the Pharisees were warning Jesus about. Herod seeks to kill you. Because that's what strong men do. They tear down instead of build up. They hoard power for themselves instead of leverage power for the sake of others. They lie to their benefit and run roughshod over truth to serve their own agenda. They seek the survival of the fittest and see themselves as the fittest and the weaker ones as expendable. It is an old story with these men. And so there is nothing new, unfortunately, that we are witnessing in our own country right now. And it will end in disaster for them and potentially a lot of us too. The strong man dominating for his own benefit. And unfortunately, it's nothing new across the last 2 millennia that Christians, followers of Jesus, despite the figure who hangs silent and still, dying on a cross at the still center of the chaotic world, they line up behind and support the strong men who promise earthly power and dominance. They do not trust that God has got this. They are afraid that in the great cosmic battle, somehow God's losing ground, and it's their responsibility to storm the Capitol to reclaim it for God. The same thing was done during the time of the Crusades when Muslims were gaining ground in Europe. Suddenly, the nonviolent God of suffering and love is not convenient for their purposes, and so they turn to the idol God of domination and control instead of the true God of sacrifice and love. They take up their weapons and rush in to fix things for their God, things that God never asked them to fix in the first place. This is what Jesus was seeing 2 millennia ago as he lamented with a heart full of sorrow over wayward Jerusalem, who killed the prophets and stoned those who were sent to it. And make no mistake, the prophets were always saying the same thing when they came and were killed in Jerusalem. They were always saying, the reason they were killed, they were always saying, that justice for the weak and the marginalized and the powerless was not being served by Israel. That those in power were at work to benefit themselves and their own and leaving the most vulnerable out to fend for themselves. And the prophets went on, God was not happy with this. This was not how God designed Israel to be. This was not how God wanted Israel to be a light for the nations. It was going to be different with Israel. And that there would be consequences for such neglect of the poor and the vulnerable. That's what the prophets were constantly hammering on, and it made the people in power crazy, angry. So Abraham Joshua Heschel is the great Jewish theologian and philosopher of the 20th century, and has this beautiful book on the prophets. And it talks about what the prophets were distressed by was how we humans tend to accommodate ourselves to injustices that we barely see. He says in this book, The Prophets, indeed, the sort of crimes and even the amount of delinquency that fill the prophets of Israel with dismay do not go beyond that which we regard as normal, as typical ingredients of social dynamics. To us, a single act of injustice, cheating in business, exploitation of the poor, is slight. To the prophets, it's a disaster. To us, injustice is injurious to the welfare of the people. To the prophets, it is a death blow to existence. To us, an episode, to them, a catastrophe, a threat to the world. The prophets were those who were able to hold this dissonance between the way the human world generally operated, which was necessarily for the benefit of some and most often for the benefit of some at the expense of others, and they were able to hold that with God's economy and order of design, which is designed, for the good of all, and especially for those on the bottom. And the prophets saw the disasters coming when God's order was ignored. But for the prophets, For the prophets, it was never men lying with men or women lying with women that was the problem, or the undermining of traditional family values. It was always the neglect and exploitation of the poor. That's what they said would be our undoing. So let's hear more from Heschel on this account to get a clear sense of where Israel and America itself now goes astray. Why were so few voices raised in the ancient world, Heschel asks, in protest against the ruthlessness of man? Why are human beings so obsequious, ready to kill and ready to die at the call of kings and chieftains? Perhaps it is because they worship might, venerate those who command might, and are convinced that it is by force that man prevails. The splendor and the pride of kings blind the people. The prophets repudiate the work as well as the power of man as an object of supreme adoration. They denounce arrogant boasting and haughty pride. He's quoting from certain of the prophets. They denounce arrogant boasting and haughty pride, the kings who ruled the nations in anger, the destroyers of nations who went forth to inflict waste, ruin, and death. That's from Jeremiah. The guilty men whose own might is their God. That's Habakkuk chapter 1. Their course is evil. Their might is not right. Jeremiah 23. That's what the prophets did, and that's why they were killed. The worshiping of might is where we find ourselves once again in 21st century America, the bowing to the strong man, and so many Christians themselves don't see it, or at least think this time it's necessary. One of my favorite movie images that I often quote comes from the kids' movie called the Bee Movie, B-E-E movie, where the protagonist Bee is trying to get outside and he's flying into the window saying, this time, this time, this time, this time, this time. Smack, 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 smack. Now we'll finally have a strong man to save our country from the evils of the deep state or the woke police or the liberal elite or whatever we need saving from. Finally this time. Violence will serve good. This time, this time, this time, this time, this time. Oh, America, America, what are you doing? What have you done? Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, Jesus says, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you. It's a poignant lament because Jesus is quite aware that he's likely to be the next victim, the next prophet sent to that city and executed. But the imagery Jesus uses to speak of himself versus the strong man Herod is striking and could not be clearer in contrast, right? You heard Jesus say, tell that fox Herod, tell that fox Herod, Jesus says to the Pharisees who are trying to keep Jesus safe, tell that fox Herod that I am not done here with what I need to do, buddy. And then he uses an image for himself that could not be clearer for what his approach and commitment is. He says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, I long to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and yet you were not willing. As a hen gathers her chicks. It's this beautiful feminine image for himself. He uses in the face of the masculine, violent image of a fox come to eat the chicks. And here I want to share with you a description of this from this wonderful preacher, Barbara Brown Taylor, that many of you might know, writer and preacher. And she clarifies where Jesus is going with this imagery. Given the number, she says, and I'm quoting at length here, given the number of animals available, it is curious that Jesus chooses a hen. Where is the biblical precedent for that? What about the mighty eagle of Exodus or Hosea's stealthy leopard? What about the proud lion of Judah mowing down his enemies with a roar? Compared to any of those, a mother hen does not inspire much confidence. No wonder some of the chicks decided to go with the fox. But a hen is what Jesus chooses, which, if you think about it, is pretty typical of him, always wrecking our expectations of how things should turn out by giving prizes to losers and paying the last first. So, of course, he chooses a chicken. So the options become very clear. You can live by licking your chops, or you can die protecting the chicks. You can live by licking your chops, or you can die protecting the chicks. Jesus won't be king of the jungle in this story or any other story. What he will be is a mother hen who stands between the chicks and those who mean to do them harm. She has no fangs, no claws, no rippling muscles. All she has is her willingness to shield her babies with her own body. If the fox wants them, he will have to kill her first, which he does, as it turns out. He slides up on her one night in the yard while all the babies are asleep. When her cry awakens them, they scatter. She dies the next day where both foxes and chickens can see her wings spread, breast exposed, without a single chick beneath her feathers. It breaks her heart. End of quote. But it saves the world and is the only way the world will be saved. It will not be saved by strong men. It will not be saved through destruction and violence. It will not be saved through military might. Why can't we learn this lesson given so long ago? It will be saved through love, through the vulnerable giving of self to others in love. That is the heart of the story of Jesus Christ. That is his energy in the world and always has been, no other. That is the empty space where God's finger touches the wild, chaotic world and holds it still out of love for it and whispers it back towards wholeness. In these days, may we find that center in ourselves so that we can be a part of that whispering becoming of a world in travail.